Okay, welcome back, everybody. Um, Here is our next installment in our video series dealing with 1970s United States history. First, we dealt with how the Middle East would come to be a focal point of U.S. foreign policy. Then we talked about, and it's kind of connected because of the oil embargo. We talked about the economic situation, and namely the stagflation that took hold of the U.S. economy into the 1970s, which in itself played a large role in dictating the change in approach to our foreign policy. We saw something very similar during the Depression. An aggressive neo-colonial policy towards Latin America because of the Depression gave way to the good neighbor policy. 1970 is very similar. Stagflation gave way to détente because détente is a lot more inexpensive than containment and brinkmanship. So quite often you'd be surprised how often economics, the current economic situation, dictates the course of a country's foreign policy. Starting with Nixon and into Ford and even to Carter, the name of the game is détente. Okay, an acceptance, to an extent, that we live in a bipolar world. The United States in the West has its sphere of influence. The Soviet Union and its allies have its sphere of influence. And there is still the third world that is still up for grabs. Okay. And there's some major players in there, to scoop up, what's left of the third world to decide on which side they're going to be involved in. Um, is there a bit of hypocrisy? Sure. When the Nixon and later Ford administration um, embraced détente, it's well, that's skillful diplomacy. That's the use of skillful diplomacy. These are the moves of a master chess player, Mr. Kissinger. But when the Democratic administration follows the same approach, well, that's weakness. That's weakness before our enemy. So, there's a lot of double standards. Okay, so this is going to possibly be a long one. Whole lot of detail, okay? Because believe it or not, the Carter administration and the Ford administration are usually not looked at as banner presidencies for foreign policy, but despite they taught, a lot went on. A lot that we're not even going to be able to go over because a lot of it takes place in the so-called third world. So let's start here. Gerald Ford, successor to President Nixon. Gerald Ford, like his predecessor, when it comes to foreign policy, there's not much to say other than he attempted to continue the policy of détente. The Vietnam War was over and done with. We did not have diplomatic relations with Vietnam. We did not trade with Vietnam, but that was over and done with. Final. Um, let's talk a little bit about Ford's team, only because I want you to remember stuff because they're going to come back. Some of the people that Ford brings into his administration are going to show up again. They're going to show up when Reagan's in the White House. They're going to show up again when Bush is in the White House and when Bush's son, George W. Bush, is in the White House. For example, during Ford's administration, director of the CIA would be George Herbert Walker Bush, himself the son of a senator. Okay. For the sake of keeping this video relatively manageable as far as time-wise, we're going to leave it at that. He was very involved with the CIA going back to the early 60s. In fact, one of the ships that was used by the Bay of Pigs landing party was actually a ship that was lent to that landing party by Bush's oil company that he ran in Texas called Zapata Oil. That doesn't mean the family's from Texas. The family is actually from Massachusetts. That's all just manufactured. First president we would ever have that was a former CIA director. Donald Rumsfeld would be Ford's chief of staff. Would move on Okay, I believe he was Reagan's Secretary of Defense and would also be Secretary of Defense under the George W. Bush administration and one of the chief architects of the U.S. invasion under false pretenses of Iraq in 2003. Ford's campaign manager was Richard Cheney. Richard Cheney would go on to lose a lot of hair, but Richard Cheney, we would see him again in the Reagan administration, okay? And then eventually vice president under George W. Bush. Some claim the actual president. So by all means, this is what these are the same people, the revolving door that goes all the way back to Ford. Not quite Nixon's people, Ford's people, Reagan's people, both Bush's people is the same people. All right. If Ford had any significant foreign policy win, it was the Helsinki Accords. In the spirit of détente and bettering relations with the Soviet Union, we decided to meet in Helsinki in the summer of 1975. 33 nations were part of this, promising to agree to continue détente and to cooperate, particularly cooperation between the United States and the Soviet Union on a number of issues, and also the sticking point, an understanding of a recognition of basic human rights. And human rights is just now starting to pop up in international law as a thing. And, as much as we like to consider ourselves the champions of human rights, quite often we would have trouble with the socialist countries in the definition of rights. For example, in the United States, we would never tolerate something like, we just didn't recognize that healthcare was a right, education was a right, housing was a right, employment was a right. But in the other block, yes, it was. And so they were like, okay, you guys talk about rights, but what about these rights? Which is funny because before FDR died, he wanted to push these kinds of rights so that Congress would recognize them, and it never happened. And this is actually a question that came out in last year's Cambridge exam. So basically, the Helsinki Accords are divided into four what you call baskets. Basket 1, the U.S. and the Soviet Union agreed to settle disputes peacefully, accept each other's sphere of influence, and not get other countries involved, not get involved in the internal affairs of other countries. And of course, this sounds great on paper. Whether it would happen in real life, that's another story altogether. Because remember, we still have that Brezhnev doctrine floating around out there. Basket 2, the U.S. and the Soviet Union agreed to strengthen trade relations, strengthen technological and scientific cooperation, which had already started with the space program. Once Nixon axes the Apollo program, there is a couple of joint Apollo-Soyuz missions. So there is a significant amount of scientific cooperation between the U.S. and the Soviet Union, particularly when it comes to the space program. Basket 3, agreement to human rights, including free migration of peoples and reunification of people divided by international borders. That would be the most challenging one. And 4, agreements to continue to meet to implement and monitor proposals. And, the Helsinki Accords is, as great as the aspirations were, that had its critics, oh, that's great, but, the Soviet people are an oppressed people, what say did they have? But let's just say the Helsinki Accords, cemented the policy of détente between the Soviet Union and the United States. It has a short shelf life. Gerald Ford does not successfully defend his incumbency to the presidency. Listen, Nixon did a lot of damage Nixon did a lot of damage to the White House, and Ford did too by pardoning Nixon. And that in itself was going to give the Democrats an upper hand. They hadn't had somebody in the White House since Lyndon B. Johnson, who himself did a lot of damage to the Democrat brand, if you will, as did the party's behavior in 1968. You know, in very typical fashion, let's roll out a guy. He was actually a dark horse candidate. He was not even in the lead. People were looking at Ted Kennedy and continuing that line of succession. Um, Jimmy Carter ended up where he ended up because he was an outsider. He was the governor of Georgia. He was a liberal Democrat that could appeal both to the liberal politics of the North and to Southern voters because he was from the South. Clinton's is gonna use much of the same playbook as well. A Southern liberal. Southerners are going to forget that the candidate's liberal, and they're going to attach value to the fact that the candidate's Southern. Uh, and Jimmy Carter becomes the 39th president of the United States. And like Ford and Nixon before him, Jimmy Carter is going to have his hands full with the inflation and unemployment situation, which does not get better. And unexpectedly, you would think, well, because of détente, you know, foreign policy challenges should die down. No, President Carter is gonna have plopped on his desk quite a few foreign policy hot potatoes, which I think a lot of historians would agree would be the ending. You know, that's what really did in his presidency, his single-term presidency. Um, he attempted to continue the policy of détente, but you know, when a Democrat's in office, you know, the opposition tended to put another spin on it. So, like I told you guys last time, we were going to enter minefield territory, okay? We're going to talk about things that might ruffle feathers. I'm going to attempt to be as objective and neutral as possible. But to some folks, there is no amount of objectivity and neutrality that'll satisfy them, and that's just, you know, we have to accept that. I understand our community and our politics and the politics of the homes of many of my students. So, you know, again, the attempt is there, whether it will be interpreted as objectivity. I think to some folks, if you don't take a definite side, then, you know, then you're not being objective enough. Or maybe they don't understand objectivity. Well, here we go. If anything Jimmy Carter was cognizant of, it was the not so great relationship that the United States had developed with Latin America because of the Cold War. Because of the Cold War, we turned our back on the good neighbor policy. The Dulles brothers did their damage in Guatemala. The Cuban Revolution would not help, really. Okay, would actually make things worse, would justify the placement of pro-U.S. dictators throughout most of Latin America, would justify Lyndon B. Johnson sending troops to the Dominican Republic, would justify the rise of military dictatorships in Argentina and Brazil, would justify the overthrow of a democratically elected president in Chile, and so on and so on. Um, a lot of blood, so, we're back to the relationship that used to exist before FDR. A quite strained relationship. Maybe not between the leaders of Latin America and the United States, but definitely between many of the people of Latin America, particularly the poor people, and the United States. Jimmy Carter was cognizant of this. Jimmy Carter took cognizant steps to try to repair, mitigate the Cuban Revolution, who was still trying to export revolution, who was still training revolutionaries in Cuba, who throughout the 70s and the 80s was the second most armed country in the Americas, armed to the teeth. Okay? All of those arms coming from the Soviet Union. How do you mitigate that and at the same time repair the bad blood between the United States and the Soviet Union and at the same time assure folks that you're not opening the door to another Cuba in Latin America. One of the examples was U.S. Panamanian relationships. Panama at the time had a long time de facto leader, Omar Torrijos, who came out of the ranks of the military, but was actually very populist. Poured a lot of money into housing for the poor and expanding education and land reform and et cetera, et cetera. Um, and this is going to be criticized by the Reagan administration, but one of the olive branches that Jimmy Carter extended to Latin America was signing over the Panama Canal to Panama, which had been a sticking point since its inception. So Jimmy Carter, long story short, in 1978, signed a treaty with Omar Torrijos from Panama, signing over ownership of the Panama Canal starting in the year 2000 to Panama, and it was ratified by the Senate. Uh, Jimmy Carter saw it as a step in improving relations with Latin America, but not everybody did, particularly conservatives in Congress. In the words of Ronald Reagan, that's our canal. We built it. We paid for it. And Carter had no right to give it away. But, well, what about the land? It was Panamanian land, Panamanian labor. So nonetheless, this story continues actually, okay? Because in 81, Torrijos dies in a plane crash. And many fingers point to the United States, particularly the CIA, being involved in Torrijos' plane coming down and crashing. Torrijos' successor, and we're going to talk about him much later, not immediate successor, but eventual successor, Manuel Noriega, claims that he had proof, documented proof, that the CIA was behind the assassination. Why? Because Torrijos, just before his plane went down, was negotiating with Japanese investors to expand the canal. And that particular deal left out a number of big American contractors that also would have been interested in such a deal. But in 89, Panama was invaded by the United States, and those documents disappeared and have never been found. So, the death of Omar Torrijos is still very much a mystery. Now let's move on, because 1978 and especially 1979 turned out to be quite interesting. These we're going to get into some detail. Before we go any further, I'm sorry, we're not there yet. Jimmy Carter has a huge foreign policy win. Jimmy Carter is able to successfully mediate between Israel and Egypt. All Egypt has to do is recognize Israel's right to exist, okay? And Israel gives Egypt, and Israel's right to access the Suez Canal, and Israel gives Egypt back the Sinai Desert. That's exactly what happened. The Gaza Strip it's both Israel and Egypt agree to administer the Gaza Strip and its border. The Gaza Strip basically being the world's largest refugee camp of nationless, displaced Palestinian people. But the good thing about the Camp David Accords, it established peace between Israel and Egypt, which has existed till this day. And so at least that sticking point was gone. Anwar Sadat was the Egyptian prime minister that signed the peace accords. He was Nasser's successor. Just a little spoiler alert. The thanks that Sadat got for bringing peace between Israel and Egypt, he got killed in an assassination that was carried out by a number of army officers from Egypt. And this is how Mubarak ends up in charge of Egypt. So another foreign policy win in the spirit of détente for Jimmy Carter, a continuation of the SALT I talks. Jimmy Carter was able to successfully, in June of 1979, engage the Soviet Union in another round of reducing nuclear armaments. Okay. And now we get to our minefield, huh? July 19th, 1979. Nicaragua, 20 years later, becomes the second country in Latin America to wage and finally succeed in waging a revolution that would oust a US-backed dictator, actually a dynasty that had been there for many years, and implement a socialist-style revolutionary government. so, so we're gonna start the story because the Nicaraguan Revolution, the Sandinista Revolution, is incredibly fascinating, and not a lot of people know the story. And you guys do, because remember last year when we talked about the civil war that existed in Nicaragua around the turn of the century and how the U.S. intervened on behalf of the conservatives, occupied Nicaragua. I mean, if you add up all the years, for almost 30 years. And then when the Great Depression hit, orchestrated a withdrawal from Nicaragua by creating a National Guard, with the idea that the National Guard would keep the peace and order in Nicaragua and the U.S. could withdraw because, frankly, it was expensive. It was the Depression. And exactly that's what exactly happened, except that out of this National Guard, and we're going to see this pattern repeat itself throughout Latin America, emerged a strong man with a lot of support in the National Guard, with all the guns in his pocket, and himself would declare himself dictator. And this was Somoza. And the Somoza dictatorship, which was passed on for 3 generations, eventually ending in 1979, or Anastasio Somoza de Baile being the last dictator of that dynasty that went all the way back to 1936. So, if we could simplify and reduce, the revolution in Nicaragua, first of all, yes, the inspiration is Cuba, absolutely. But what a lot of people don't know, takes a lot longer, is an incredibly bloodier affair than the Cuban Revolution was. It starts, well, here we have a map of Nicaragua, so you should familiarize yourself where Managua is, León specifically, and Granada. See, most of the Nicaraguan population is along the Pacific coast. That's true. Um, and there you have pictures of young Sandinistas as they poured into Managua in July of 1979. So let's do a very brief overview of how this story played out. Yes, the Cuban Revolution is very much the inspiration. The man you see at the corner is Carlos Fonseca. Carlos Fonseca was the founder of the Sandinista Front for National Liberation, the FSLN, which is what it was called, or for short, the Sandinistas, who took their name after the famous liberal guerrilla leader, Agosto Sandino, who fought both the conservative government and the Marines that reinforced that conservative government that were the occupation force of the United States throughout the 1930s, who himself was lured and assassinated by the first Somoza, which allowed Somoza to establish a dictatorship. So the inspiration is both the Cuban Revolution and the story of Augusto Sandino. The Sandinistas started as a group of student activists at the Autonomous University of Managua. Their politics was left, was Marxist. Their inspiration was Cuban, and the idea that, we're also, ruled by a U.S.-backed dictator. Maybe the Cuban Revolution, the model of the Cuban Revolution, could repeat itself here. Okay? The first 10 years of the existence of this group is rather, uneventful. They're a small group. They don't have broad support. Many of the leaders are going to have to, a lot of them travel to Cuba and receive training. A good number of them end up going to Costa Rica, and so most of the In the beginning, the Sandinista leadership is based out of Costa Rica. But Somoza, is absolutely obsessed with these guys. And even though they're a small group that don't present an existential threat, he resorts to repression, censoring the press, etc., to go after this group that he considers to be an existential threat, even though they're small and a lot of their leadership's in Costa Rica, etc., etc. And then 1972 comes, and that is the year of the earthquake, an earthquake that completely levels the city of Managua. The city of Managua that exists today is all post 1972. The old city still lays in ruins and is not used. Thousands and thousands die. Tons of aid pours into the country from the United Nations, from the Red Cross, from all sorts of other countries. And it becomes apparent that the aid is not reaching people. It becomes apparent that Somoza and the institution that reinforced and guaranteed Somoza's rule, the National Guard, were hogging all the money. And the aid that was intended for the Nicaraguan people was actually being sold by the National Guard. See, these were not nice people, okay? The National Guard was the security apparatus of the country, Nicaragua, but they also had their hands in narco traffic and prostitution and illegal gambling and arms trafficking, all sorts of nefarious business prospects, of which the Somoza family always got a cut. The Somoza family was the number one landowner in the country. So, the people that are going to be on, the side of the establishment is the military, is the landed elite, it's the church, even though the church is going to experience divisions, and then of course it's the Somoza family itself at the head of this pyramid. That earthquake does a lot of damage to any popular support that the Somoza dictatorship had. Okay? And it starts to turn people against the government because of how cold and indifferent the government was towards the Nicaraguan people after this earthquake, and the fact that it was embezzling and profiting off the aid coming into the country. And this is going to help the argument of the Sandinistas. This is going to add fuel for what years they've been talking about, removing Somoza from power. And then 1974 comes. Spectacular. Out of nowhere. A small group of Sandinistas lay siege on the home of the Minister of Agriculture. And they timed it so when the U.S. ambassador left, they took charge of that estate. They took hostages, the Minister of Agriculture being one. And this became front page news. They demanded millions of dollars. They demanded the release of 14 prisoners. One of them being future Daniel Ortega. And they demanded millions of dollars. And for the papers to run basically the platform of the Sandinista, the National Liberation Front, the Sandinista Liberation Front. Actually, the Minister of Agriculture ends up getting killed. And by all means, the siege of that house and the taking of hostages, and the government complied and gave them the money and flew them out of Cuba, released the prisoners and flew them to Cuba as well. And that was a huge win for the Sandinistas. From there, they go from being a small, obscure, little-known opposition group of activists to being the real deal. Somoza responds with a massive crackdown, particularly targeted at Nicaraguan youth. Everything from arrest, detention, summary executions, censoring of papers, etc., etc. In that 1975 crackdown, the founder of the Sandinistas is killed, Carlos Fonseca. because a peasant ratted him out that he was in the area. So the rest of the 70s actually works out in Somoza's favor in a way because the Sandinistas kind of split into three competing factions. Okay. And by the way, of the 10 founders of the Sandinista Front for National Liberation, only one would survive to witness the triumph of the Sandinista Revolution. Carlos Fonseca would not be one of them. Only one of those 10 original founders would survive to see that. The Sandinista Party split into three factions. You had one tendency, Guerra Popular Prolongada, which basically wanted to model the Nicaraguan Revolution after the Cuban Revolution, take to the mountains, take to the countryside, and lay siege on the cities from there as you build up your rebel force. Another tendency was of the opinion that Nicaragua was not Cuba. Nicaragua had already become a nation of wage workers. There was a significant amount of manufacturing in Nicaragua, and therefore Nicaragua had to adopt a model that relied more on urban warfare and the taking over of the cities and clandestine activities in the cities to confront the Somoza government and the National Guard. And then there was a third tendency, which called for a united front. I guess their approach was softer. Instead of waging a guerrilla war in the countryside or guerrilla warfare in the cities, they would rely on nonviolent strikes and protests. Why? So they could build an alliance with liberal and even conservative opposition to the Somoza government, which after 1972 had already begun to emerge. And the leading figure in that third faction was Daniel Ortega. The Terceristas made it a point to create alliances, a united front with liberal and bourgeois elements that were opposed to the Somoza dictatorship. And it's this Tercerista faction that would enjoy the greatest success because they could grab a greater share of opposition to Somoza's dictatorship by working together with liberals and conservatives that happen to oppose the Somoza government. They end up setting up a government in exile in Costa Rica. So now you have, thanks to that third faction, a rather broad pluralist opposition to the Somoza government. Then 1978 comes. And this is the powder keg moment. Leading mainstream newspaper reporter Pedro Chamorro, very popular among the bourgeois opposition to Somoza, is assassinated. And many fingers point to the Somoza government itself because of its criticism of the government. That united front government that exists in Costa Rica, which now represents, the dominant faction of the Sandinista front, calls for a 10-day strike. At this point, Nicaragua enters the point of civil war. At this point, more and more people are starting to drift into the direction of the Sandinistas. Somoza claims that he's not going to be intimidated by the strikes, that he is going to stay until 1981, and they'll set up elections and he'll leave, but he's not going to leave when they tell him to leave. It's not just Chamorro that was killed, but soon after that the National Guard also executes an ABC reporter. And that's when the Carter administration turns on Somoza after supporting that government since 1936. And the U.S. withdraws military aid. What a lot of people don't know is that Israel would fill that vacuum. and Israel would begin to pump in up to 90% of the armaments that the Somoza government required through Panama. A lot of people don't know this. So, um, the Sandinitas gain more and more members, and they become bolder in their willingness to confront the National Guard. An even bigger, more spectacular event than the taking of the Minister of Agriculture's house years earlier.
Here's a reminder. Meeting tomorrow at 2:45.
The Sandinitas, a group of Sandinitas from the Tercerista faction, take over the Nicaraguan Congress.
Here's a reminder. Meeting tomorrow at
They take over the Nicaraguan Congress. They hold 1,000 hostages.
I don't know that.
They ask for ransom money, another prisoner release, okay, and on the national media to broadcast, the demands of the Sandinista Liberation Front, which is the removal of Somoza from power. In the wake of that second spectacular victory, and by the way, in between, this is a bloody exchange. National Guards are going after Sandinitas and suspected Sandinitas. Sandinitas are going after National Guardsmen and supporters of the Somoza government. So there is a lot of blood that is being shed in this country that's not necessarily a very large population to begin with. A couple of months after taking Congress, the Sandinitas go into the final phase, and they call for the cities to rise up against Somoza's government. 6 cities rise up. This is a September insurrection, starting with the city of León. The Sandinitas become bold enough that they start attacking National Guard posts outright. Somoza responds with the bombing of León. Okay, he actually tells his air force to bomb anything that moves until it stops moving. Riding the tide of success after success, particularly when it came to public opinion, the three factions unite to form a united, Sandinista Front for National Liberation, FSLN. They form a 9-man directorate. This 9-man directorate eventually is going to become the provisional government. Tens of thousands flock to the FSLN now. By 1979, 5 of Nicaragua's biggest cities become the 5 fronts of the Nicaraguan Revolution, including Managua. In June of 79, they call for another general strike. Okay. And it seems like all these factions came in together. Both the armed struggle in the countryside, the resistance in the cities, and the orchestrated efforts of this alliance of convenience between the Sandinitas, the liberals, and even conservative opposition, even though the liberals and conservatives are going to be pushed to the side. July 17th, 1979, Anastasio Somoza agrees to leave the country. 2 days later, the Sandinista army enters Managua, and that provisional government that was those 9 men that formed that directorate of United FSLN become the new government of Nicaragua, and that is seen as the day that the Nicaraguan Revolution finally triumphed over the Somoza dictatorship and came to power. And it's going to be tough, okay? It's going to be tough because Carter decides a hands-off approach with the Nicaraguans. He's cognizant he doesn't want and would be incredibly criticized if another Cuba were to reemerge. But at the same time, he doesn't want to employ the strong arm tactics the administrations before his. The Nicaraguans say, yes, they want to build socialism, but not necessarily copy Cuba. The next couple of years are going to introduce significant reforms and changes um, to Nicaragua. And by the way, just so you know, the cost of the Nicaraguan Revolution, 50,000 dead. 50,000 dead, and the vast majority of them in the late 70s. Between 50,000 dead between 1974 and 1979. 150,000 in exile. Something like, I don't have the number, but hundreds of thousands homeless, and $480 million in damages. So Nicaragua had to rebuild a country that had been devastated by, the cost of this revolution. And yes, Cuba would figure in very prominently in assisting the Nicaraguans in putting together a type of government that was very much modeled, but not completely. There were still opposition papers, there were still labor unions, there were still protests. Crying out loud, there was even elections in 1984. Um, this is the part that might, upset, you know, some folks watching. 1980, Nicaragua had a massive literacy campaign. Illiteracy that used to be at 50% was reduced to 12. Okay. Land reform. For the first time, land was distributed to people, the landless peasants. Land that much of it was in the hands of multinationals, if not the Somoza family or National Guards. The National Guard in Somoza, they left. Somoza went to Miami. Very typical. Many National Guardsmen went to Miami. One of them opened up Los Ranchos, by the way. And these are not nice people. These are people that would throw people, suspected Sandinitas, inside the crater of a volcano, by the way. Um, Somoza's going to end up in Paraguay and be assassinated there by Argentine Marxists. Um, so yes, the education campaign reduced illiteracy to 12%. Ever since when the Sandinitas left, illiteracy is going to jump back up again to the point that Nicaragua is the country with the highest rate of adult illiteracy in Latin America. Um, Polio was eliminated from Nicaragua. Healthcare was introduced in Nicaragua, much like the Cuban style of polyclinics, et cetera, which is actually a Soviet model. Women's rights catapulted. We saw the introduction of more women going, in a very machista society, women going to university, women going into the workplace. There were female Sandinistas that were very active in the revolution. So tons of reforms in typical fashion headed at improving healthcare, education. With Cuba, they tried to build a road that cut across the country. They didn't quite finish that one. Land reform, et cetera, et cetera. And Daniel Ortega, who was not even one of the original 10 founders of the Sandinistas, becomes the top dog in Nicaragua. Like I told you earlier, this is going to be a long one. This is going to be a long one.